What's up, everyone? Mike Wellman here for TYT Sports. Be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at MikeWellman88, and you can check out my YouTube channel, The MMA Word. We're here to talk about the first half of 2017 in the UFC. Has the UFC had a good 2017 so far? We are about halfway through 2017. Hope you all had a happy and safe 4th of July. Has the UFC had a good year, a good first half of the year? We're going to talk about their pay-per-view fights, some of the fights that have been canceled, and what we can look forward to in the second half of 2017. So the UFC came off of a very big 2017. They were able to sell the UFC for $4 billion to WME IMG. So they ended the year with Conor McGregor fighting and Ronda Rousey fighting. So those were some of the biggest UFC events of all time. Rousey lost in dramatic fashion to Amanda Nunes and presumably retired, so no Rousey in the cage in 2017, or for that matter, likely ever again. Also with McGregor, he became the two-division champion. He won the UFC lightweight title, was already the UFC featherweight champion at UFC 205 at Madison Square Garden. One of the UFC's biggest event, a landmark event, their debut in the state of New York, their debut at Madison Square Garden. Like I said, McGregor, the UFC's top star, becoming the first and only person to hold two UFC titles at the same time. So that's a big year for the UFC. Also, McGregor, their biggest pay-per-view draw, fought 3 times. He fought Diaz twice and then Eddie Alvarez, UFC 205, like I said. So going into 2017, there seemed to be a lack of star power on the UFC's fight cards. So for whatever reason, we haven't seen Conor McGregor since November. He had a child and has moved on to bigger and better things with his upcoming blockbuster pay-per-view fight against Floyd Mayweather as he retired. So let's take a look at the UFC's pay-per-views and see what fights they did have headlining their biggest events so far this year. So the first UFC pay-per-view of 2017 was in February. It was UFC 208. This one was headlined by Holly Holm versus Germaine de Randamie. The UFC sort of abruptly decided to institute a women's featherweight championship. Basically, what they wanted to do was get a big fight on this card in Brooklyn, and they wanted Cris Cyborg to finally face off for the women's featherweight championship in the UFC, finally get Cyborg in a UFC championship fight, and Cyborg couldn't make the date. Basically, she had medical issues from her previous weight cuts, so she couldn't make the date, UFC 208, basically. So they took the 2 women who had agreed to face Cyborg, Germaine de Randamie and Holly Holm, both bantamweights, and decided to put them against each other for the featherweight title. So that fight itself was filled with controversy. De Randamie landed 2 big punches that definitely impacted the fight after the bell had sounded, or after the horn had sounded, in 2 separate rounds. So 2 separate times in the fight, rounds ended, and then de Randamie caught Holm with big punches after Holm had essentially stopped defending herself. She was not penalized in any way. Both of those times could have resulted in a point deduction, meaning she could have had 2 points deducted for her cheating in that fight. Didn't happen. She won the fight. A lot of people thought, point deductions aside, Holly Holm won the fight. So nonetheless, we ended up with Germaine de Randamie as the first ever UFC women's featherweight champion. She has since refused to fight Cyborg, the only logical contender for anyone to fight at 145 pounds for a UFC championship, claiming Cyborg is a known cheater. So a lot of people have thoughts on that. A lot of people think she's avoiding Cyborg. But nonetheless, she's been stripped of that title already, and Cyborg is going to face Tanya Evinger coming up for the now vacant UFC women's featherweight title. Then you had UFC 209, headlined by Woodley versus Wonderboy 2. Woodley won this one in a close fight. Not a blockbuster card here. UFC 210 in Buffalo, Daniel Cormier once again defeated Anthony Johnson, who then retired from MMA after the fight. We also had the Weidman and Mousasi kneeing controversy. That's another plague on the sport in 2017. This new package of rules update by the ABC has resulted in a patchwork of this application of the rules. So some places you go, this new rules update is in place. Some places you go, it's not. So it is, to say the least, very confusing to fighters, referees, and everyone watching. So, and then UFC 211 in Dallas. This was probably the biggest, best card of the year so far. There's a few big ones coming up, which we're going to talk about, but UFC 211 was probably the highlight of the first half of 2017. Big event in Dallas, Texas. Stipe Miocic defended the heavyweight title. Joanna Jędrzejczyk defended the women's strawweight title. Frankie Edgar put on a absolute destruction against Yair Rodriguez. We had the Poirier versus Alvarez knee controversy that ended that one in a no contest. Like I said, the new rules being implemented. There's been a lot of controversy, a lot of bad stoppages, a lot of bad endings to fights so far because of the unified rules becoming less unified. So another bright spot of the first half of 2016 was Max Holloway, brah. We're in the blessed era. Hashtag UFC Hawaii. Hashtag UFC Waianae. Holloway finished Jose Aldo and now is surprisingly at the absolute top of the sport. I mean, Max Holloway might be one of the top 5 MMA fighters on the planet right now, for sure. He's on an 11-fight win streak. At his most recent win, at the top of the win streak, he's defeated Jose Aldo, one of the greatest fighters of all time. So Max Holloway could be the best fighter below 170, obviously not counting Demetrius Johnson. There were some Fox cards as well this year. The UFC had a lot of Fight Night cards, a lot of Fox cards. BJ Penn suffered 2 brutal losses, legacy-impacting losses in 2017, so that's not good. Alexander Gustafsson came back. He bopped Glover Teixeira a few times, put him away. He's probably going to be looking at a rematch with John Jones. If John Jones can stay on track and get back in the cage. So yeah, there were a few bright spots so far this year. Rousey, McGregor, Lesnar was suspended and retired, and he fought last year. So the UFC doesn't have a plethora of new big stars coming down the pipe. I mean, but we do nonetheless have a new crop of dominant champions emerging, right? Joanna, Stipe, Max Holloway. A few big fights got canceled. The Ultimate Fighter finale championship International Fight Week main event was supposed to be one of the UFC's newest big stars, Cody Garbrandt, taking on TJ Dillashaw. That is an extremely anticipated fight. That one fell off. That one's tabled for later on in the year, so that one is something that we have to look forward to. Dillashaw versus Garbrandt. I really like that fight. But yeah, if the UFC had been able to put on these fights that they wanted to, Khabib versus Tony Ferguson, they'd have a little more momentum, right? But what we're noticing is the big fights haven't happened. We haven't seen Bisping versus GSP. Call that a big fight. A lot of people were even upset that that fight got made, but nonetheless, we haven't seen it. So Bisping, the middleweight title has been on ice. Bisping, GSP, then they both get injured separately, so now we have Romero-Whittaker for the interim title. So, like I said, big fights that could have sprinkled in a few more peaks to the first half of 2017 didn't happen. But nonetheless, we have a lot to look forward to for the second half of 2017. So, and there's a whole video worth of discussion here. I'm just going to drop this one. You guys can talk about it in the comments. No Diaz brothers in the cage in 2017, and it doesn't look likely. As far as actual in-cage activity, my favorite in-cage moment so far, 2017, I know what you're thinking. It was not Justine Kish shitting her pants a few weeks ago, although that was up there. Darren Elkins' come-from-behind win over Mirsad Bektic at UFC 209. There was a lot of good in-cage moments so far this year, but this was, in my opinion, the best. Like I said, UFC 209, Elkins versus Bektic. Going into round 3, Darren Elkins was losing terribly, getting bloodied and beaten by Bektic. He spent the first 2 rounds on his back. Then in round 3, he was able to attempt a heel hook, scramble to his feet, landed some shots that hurt Bektic, and then put together a punch and kick combination that knocked Bektic out and finished the fight. One of the best comebacks I've ever seen. Like I said, Elkins was losing that fight, and he just comes back and gets the win in the 3rd round. Almost makes up for the tattoo that he has on his chest. So, but like I said, I just wanted to get that in there as far as an actual in-cage moment for the first half of the year. And then, what does the rest of 2017 hold? Well, we've got July, which is a huge month for the UFC. It's a huge month for the sport of MMA. UFC 213 and 14, International Fight Week. You might be watching this after that one already happened. UFC 214, that's the big one. UFC 214 has the potential to be one of the biggest nights in the history of MMA. You've got Jones versus Cormier, the rematch, the 2 best male fighters in this sport ever facing off against each other. Chris Cyborg, Woodley versus Maia. Now, if you have Cerrone, Lawler on that card, my brain has melted. So just UFC 214, not just one of the biggest cards of the year, could be one of the biggest cards of all time. GSP's return, we still have that to look forward to. probably. GSP hasn't been seen in the octagon since UFC 167. Supposed to fight Michael Bisping. We'll see if that one happens. He's also got the winner of Woodley versus Maia that the UFC is now saying he wants to fight for the welterweight title against. And then there's also the biggest possible fight in the sport of MMA that's feasible right now, which is GSP versus Conor McGregor. McGregor's return to UFC is another thing to look forward to. If he comes back after this $100 million payday against Floyd Mayweather, regardless of how he looks in that fight, regardless of how bad he loses in that fight, a GSP fight for McGregor would be gigantic, as big of a fight as the UFC can make. They've also got Nate Diaz. They could run back the trilogy with Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz. I mean, you can print money on that one. And Conor versus... Habib. Yeah, Dana White is now saying that after this fight, Conor wants Habib in Russia, which, I mean, I tweeted afterwards, if you give me $100 million right now, I'll fight Habib in Russia for free. No, it's basically saying, like, that's the toughest option available for McGregor right now would be Habib in Russia. McGregor's going to say whatever he needs to drum up his return to the UFC, especially if he doesn't look so good against Mayweather. But nonetheless, he's got several big options for the end of the year if he can likely return. So yeah, Conor McGregor versus Habib in Russia. Put that one down for not likely to happen, especially in 2017. But it seems like the UFC has a big second half of 2017. All the fights that we couldn't see in the first half seem to be tabled for the second half. Like I said, got Garbrandt versus Dillashaw, GSP versus either the middleweight or welterweight champion, McGregor's possible return to defend the lightweight title. So it seems like what we didn't get in the first half of 2017, we will hopefully get in the second half of 2017. What do you think? Anything you guys noticed about the first half of 2017? Do you feel like the UFC has sort of lost a lot of buzz coming into 2017? Are you excited for the second half of 2017? Let us know in the comments section below. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at MikeWellman88. Give my YouTube channel a subscription, The MMA Word, and be sure to subscribe to TYT Sports.